G'day guys, it's John here. I'd like to talk on optics, and I'm going to try to explain this in the simplest possible way that I can for the new shooter. If I start getting a little bit complex, I'm sorry. There's so much stuff that can tie together here that I find it hard to just keep things basic, but I'm going to try my best. Mils and MOA. Those are the two predominant adjustments that we can get scopes in, and there's often a lot of debate about which is right or which is best. It does not matter. Both of those will work perfectly fine. I will leave a link in the comments or in the description so that you can read an article written by Frank Gallie at Sniper's Hide. I cannot explain it better than him. He has a very good, clear article on mils versus MOA and how they relate to each other in real life. But to keep this very simple, I'm going to explain it this way. Both mils and MOA are angular measurements. Mils are not a metric-based system. It just so happens that they work into base 10 math. So, for instance, if a target is 1,000 yards away and the target is 1 yard high, that is 1 mil. But the mil actually refers to the angle that is required to cover that 1,000th of the distance. So a mil actually equals 0.0573 degrees. MOA, on the other hand, is based on 1/60th of an angle. The same way there is 60 minutes in an hour. And so a MOA is the equivalent or is equal to 0.0167 degrees. Another way to look at this is mils and MOA are the same as Celsius and Fahrenheit is to temperature. There are other ways to record temperature. They all relate to each other, and in this sense they all relate to each other in degrees because they are all angular measurements. Now what I have here, I have a barrel and an optic. This is the line of bore. This here is the center line of the optic. And here I have the bullet drop for a CCI standard velocity. At 200 yards, I have 7.3 mils of drop, or 25.25 MOA of drop. And those are the two measurements that we would use to dial or hold over in the reticle on our optic. So I have two very similar reticles here. This is the EBR7C MOA and the EBR7C in milliradians from Vortex. If I was to be shooting at that target and I was to be using my reticle to hold over, in an MOA based reticle I would have to hold 25.25 MOA. And that would put me right about here. And I could hold this point on the target and I would hit the target. If I was using the milliradian based target, then I would hold 7.3 mils, which would be approximately right there. As you can see, in use, it is very similar, if not identical. But we're simply dealing with different angular numbers. Another way to look at that 200-yard drop is it is the equivalent of approximately 0.42 degrees. So forget about this, I think, in inches. So MOA will work better for me. It will not. There is no connection between feet and inches and centimeters and meters to mils and MOA. These are angular measurements. It just so happens that mils suits the thought process of metric better, and MOA potentially suits the thought process of feet per 100 yards better, but that is not an accurate way to think about it, so disregard it. When dealing with drop, do yourself a favor and do not think of your drop in so many inches at a certain distance. Think of your drop in the angular measurement that you are going to use on your optic. And all of a sudden, MOA or mils, there is no difference in practical use. Now what I should say is, if your friends shoot all MOA or all mils, then for you guys shooting together, calling misses, it would be better if you buy an optic that matches with your friends so that you can talk the same language. But otherwise, don't worry about it. You're going to do just fine with both. Alright, so another feature that I'm going to suggest need on your scope for shooting a match is a first focal plane. And what that means is that the reticle changes size with the magnification. On a second focal plane optic, you will have a specific magnification that you will have to have your scope set to in order for the subtensions in the reticle to match with what they're supposed to. So for instance, if this was a first focal plane reticle or scope, and I'm looking at a 200-yard target, and that target is 7 inches, that target is going to take up 1 mil of my reticle, just like so. And now if I turn up that magnification from 12 to say 24, everything is going to appear larger, but my target is still going to cover the reticle 1 mil. The target is going to stay the same size in relation to the reticle. On a second focal plane scope, if I have the magnification set at 12, and that is where the subtensions are correct, then my target is going to cover 1 mil on the reticle. But if I turn the magnification up to 24 times, now the target will increase in size. It will double in size. And on the reticle, it will become a 2 mil target. And the reason that this is a problem is if you are using your reticle for holdovers, but more specifically wind holds, or that's usually where you will have a problem, I have to have the scope set at a certain magnification if I want to use these subtensions to accurately hold for drop and or wind. So a first focal plane is a definite must for this style of a competition. Now another thing to discuss is canted bases. If you've been on the forums or in the Facebook group, pretty soon you'll see guys talking about canted bases and how much cant do we need. Essentially what is happening, we have an optic mounted on a rifle with a 0 MOA base or a flat base. Then when we have our gun zeroed at 50 yards, we will have approximately half of the total elevation that is available in the scope to use. So in the case of a scope that has 20 mils of elevation available, once zeroed, you will have 10 mils of usable elevation. So that would allow you to dial 200 yards because we need 7.3 mils. But 250 yards is actually 10.5 mils. So I would not be able to dial for the 250 yard target. I would have to use a combination of dialing and holdover. So if we go back to our reticle here, if I dial 10 mils on my turret, I would then have to hold here at the half mil mark in order to hit my 250 yard target. When I move to my 300 yard target, I have a 4.1 mil hold that I would have to do to get a total of 14.1 mils of elevation. The way to overcome this is to run a canted base. Typically you will see bases in 20 or 30 MOA cants. But for this discussion, we are going to assume that you have a 25 MOA base that you are going to install. If you were to have your rifle zeroed at 50 yards and you were to take your optic off and install that 25 MOA canted base and reinstall the optic, theoretically your zero would have moved from 50 yards to 200 yards because you have tipped the scope down that 25 MOA or 7.3 mils or 0.42 degrees. So once you have reinstalled the scope, you would have to dial down 7.3 mils or 25 MOA to get your 50 yard zero. And now from your 50 yard zero, you will have that 10 mils of elevation plus the 7 mils that you added with the canted base for a total of 17 mils of available elevation. With 17 mils of elevation, you will be able to get past 300 yards and hit any target that you will see at a CRPS match. You can make do with a 20 MOA base. A 30 MOA base I would feel is probably the best option because that would allow you to dial for all of your targets. But having said that, there are very few targets past 250 yards at a match, and those furthest targets are not really what's going to matter overall. But if you have the option, get a 30 MOA canted base so that you can dial for all of your distances. Alright, so something else to watch when you're looking to buy an optic. If you're hoping to save some money by buying a older, cheaper optic, or even some of your new cheap optics, but by and large your new optics, this is not an issue. The turret and the reticle might not match. In this instance here, the reticle in this optic is a mil-based reticle, but the turret is an MOA based turret. One click is 1/4 MOA. So if I dial up 1 click, I have moved 1/4 MOA. But if I measure my miss with the reticle and I see that I have a 1 mil, I've missed by 1 mil, I can't come on here and dial 1 mil. I actually have to use math, and in that case I would have to dial 3.6 MOA to equal the 1 mil. This is very counterintuitive and does not work well for a long range match. So don't buy that cheaper optic that you're getting at a real deal if the turret and the reticle do not use the same angular measurements. And then another thing on some of these, the turret will actually be 1/4 inch at 100 yards, and that is not the same as 1/4 MOA. And while it may sound like there is very little difference, I would suggest reading Frank Gallie's article to see exactly how much difference that really does work out to in real life. We'll take over this here Diamondback Tactical. All of my scopes will be in mils, but that doesn't matter. This optic is an affordable optic that you can use shooting base class in the competition. This is a 4-16, which is lots of magnification for this kind of competition. Typically, you don't want to run up in 16 because your field of view is too small. Stick down somewhere in the 12 range. So we're going to start with the optic mounted on the rifle. And we're going to assume that the optic is mounted forward and backward correctly to you. At the back, we have our diopter setting. And this here, it is what adjusts the reticle to focus with your eye. So if you are nearsighted or farsighted, this here is the very same as wearing glasses or changing your prescription so that your eye focuses clearly on the reticle. And the way to do this is look at a blank white wall or up in the sky. Preferably you want nothing that your eye can focus on other than the reticle. And then you adjust this in and out to get it set to your eye. Now, take your time, close your eyes, relax, look away, look back in through the scope. If you keep focusing on the reticle, your eye, especially with younger people, will focus on the reticle even if the diopter is not set perfectly correct. I would personally set it while running in a lower magnification. Most of the manuals will tell you to do it at a higher magnification. I personally have found that while that is good, I can get it more accurately set if I have it in a lower magnification because the reticle is much finer. So that allows me to tweak the diopter to bring those very small, fine subtensions into focus clearly. Once you have it set to your eye, you can basically forget about the diopter settings. On some optics, you can tweak it to get better performance in low light, but don't worry about it starting out. And something like the Vortex, I have found to not be very finicky, we'll say, when it comes to the diopter settings. Alright, so now you have your optic zeroed, and I hope the focus doesn't keep changing here because I want to show you the turret, see how it goes. So now your optic is zeroed, and we're going to use that 200-yard target again as our example. I would want to dial on 7.3 mils. Each click on a mil radian scope is 1/10 of a mil. On an MOA scope, it would be 1/4 of a mil typically. Here we have 1 mil, 2 mils, 3, 4, 5, 6. But we see we now are back at 0. We have done the first revolution. We have 6 mils per revolution. 7 mils, 7.1, 2, 3. And now we would be able to engage the 200-yard target and hit, hopefully. After you have completed that, you will want to return to 0. We'll go to 0, but because we are in the second revolution, we have to do one more revolution down in order to be at 0. This is important to remember. If you get lost in which revolution you are, it can be very frustrating. Now with these more economical scopes, typically there is not a 0 stop, but there is an easy way for you to overcome that. If you get lost in a match, all you have to do, write down or remember how many revolutions from the bottom is your 0? So this optic, for instance, I am now at my 50-yard 0. I'm going to go down 1 revolution. There's 1. And now it stops. I have now bottomed out. Don't force it, but we've hit the bottom. So I know with this scope, if I lose my 0, or which revolution 0 is in, all I have to do is dial it all the way down, dial back up to 0, and then go 1 more revolution. So it's actually quite simple. It's not as intuitive as some other options out there, but that allows you to have a very budget-friendly scope that actually does the job perfectly fine. Now I have another optic here. This is the Viper PST Gen 2 from Vortex. This turret is set up different. It has a 0 stop. So if I dial up to my 7.3, I can do that in 1 revolution because there is 10 mils per revolution. So it becomes easier to keep track of things in a match environment. But then, after I have completed a stage, what I can do is simply dial it down and it stops. There's a hard stop there, the 0 stop. And then I just dial it back up to my 0 and I'm good to roll. This is definitely the easiest way to keep track of 0, but like I had mentioned previously, it is not entirely necessary. Alright, I thought I'd maybe show it with this here particular scope because it is very easy to see what is actually happening. This scope does not have a 0 stop, so I can dial below my 0. But what it does have is the turret stock is marked for each revolution. So when I 0 my rifle and then I set my turret to 0, I have 0 in the center and it's on the 0 line. If I move up 1 revolution or 10 mils, I am now on the 10 mil line. And now I am on the 20 mil line. And now I am on almost the 30 mil line. I have 29 mils of available elevation from 0 with this particular optic. For the windage, we can adjust the windage right 1 mil, left 1 mil, or even left 5 mils. Sometimes this may be beneficial if you are shooting a long distance with a lot of wind. This would allow you to dial all or some of the wind and then hold for the remaining wind. Personally, I would feel that you should 0 this on a calm day where there is no wind and then leave it. When you shoot a match, if you have a target at 200 yards and the wind requires you to have a 2 mil hold for wind, then just simply hold in your reticle to the 2 mil mark on the horizontal. Then if the wind would die off suddenly to half of what it was when you figured it out, you simply move to the 1 mil hold and let your shot go. But let's say, for instance, you had dialed on 1 mil of wind, and then you were holding 1 mil in the reticle for a total of 2 mils, and then your wind dies off to half. You must remember to go to center on your reticle, because center is actually 1 mil of hold. That can definitely be used, but I would feel for somebody starting out, it is much simpler for you to 0 this and then leave it alone. And that is personally what I would do at a match. Thinking about parallax, this knob on the side here for adjusting the parallax often gets referred to as the focus knob. While that is not correct, that easily describes what it is doing. When you are looking through the scope at a 500 yard target, if you have this set at 500 yards, your 500 yard target will be clear, but your 100 yard target will not be clear. Likewise, if you have it set for 100 yards, your 500-yard target will not be clear. In reality, what this knob is actually setting is something called parallax. Parallax error is what happens when you are behind the rifle and you move your eye up and down, right or left. If your parallax is set for, let's say, 300 yards, but you're looking at a 100-yard target, your reticle will appear to move on the target. So if you have your face off to one side or the other, you will have a point of impact shift on the target. But if you were to set this to 100 yards for your 100-yard target, as you move your face behind the rifle scope, the reticle and the target move together. So then you will have no parallax error. And that is because it is taking the picture of the target and putting it on the same plane or the same focal length as your, no, not focal length, I think focal plane. I'm not quite sure what you would call it for sure. But it's putting it on the same focus as your reticle. And that is why this gets called your focus knob, because it puts the target picture in the same place in relation to your eye as what the reticle is. Now in a match, we often shoot multiple different distances. So for instance, if we have a 100, a 150, and a 200-yard target, we have to choose, do we want the 100-yard target clear, the 150, or the 200-yard target? The further out you go, the further away from you, the more forgiveness you have in focus. But in a match environment, I would recommend that you set your parallax close to the furthest distance. For me personally, if I was shooting these three distances, I would set it for approximately 175 yards, and then I would shoot the whole stage without changing my parallax. Yes, the 100-yard target will not be perfectly clear, and I will potentially have some parallax error. Now, this is one of the reasons why building a good position behind the rifle and a consistent position is very important. But also, that error is going to be very small because the target is close. And then when I get out to the 200-yard target, because my parallax is set very close to the 200-yard target, I will have little to no parallax error at my further target. I personally would not take the time to adjust the parallax during a match stage while on the clock. Sometimes this may be necessary if you, say, have a 25-yard target and then would go out to a 250-yard target or something like that. But generally speaking, I would set the parallax at the beginning of each stage based on where the target array is.